Now, Brian Post here, author of From Fear to Love, Great Behavior Breakdown, sold over 1 million copies of books, spent 25 years working with adopted and foster children. I've been doing this work and consulting with schools for decades now in helping them understand children who come from trauma backgrounds. Coming up in November, and I'm going to date this podcast a little bit, coming up in November 8th and 9th of this year, 2024, we're going to be putting on a very special 2-day event in Northern California. It's the first annual California Adoption, Trauma, and Healing Conference. And one of our presenters is going to be none other than our guest today, Opal McCartney. Opal, thank you for joining. I'm super excited to talk about this very important topic.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.
Yeah. So let's just dive right in. Tell us, what does an IEP mean? Why is it important? And what can parents expect from having an IEP for their child?
So the IEP is an individual educational plan, and it is a federal document which helps our students receive the accommodations and modifications they need to succeed in school. There are 3 laws that govern an IEP, which is the 504, which is a separate, the 504 is tricky because it's a separate document than an IEP, but it's the precursor to the IEP. And the difference between a 504 and an IEP is that the IEP includes services and goals, and it's also more regulated.
Okay.
So the importance of an IEP is that it's going to be individualized for each individual child. Whatever services, accommodations, and modifications that child needs to succeed, that's what we want to do. And what I do is I help families in wording things so that the school understands how trauma has affected this child and how that trauma can be helped in the school setting.
Okay, so let me ask you a question, Opal. What kind of things might be occurring for a child in school that would indicate to the parent that perhaps they need an IEP?
So an IEP can be kind of 2 facets, either educationally based or behavior based. It's both, because when we have severe behavior, that impacts our learning. And if we have a specific learning disability, maybe difficulty visually processing or auditorily processing, then that's going to affect the education. Most of our students that have been in trauma have executive functioning difficulties. And that is the primary basis for many of our students, whether that comes up.
When you say executive functioning, what do you mean?
So executive functioning is the ability to use multiple parts of your brain at the same time. So if I'm going to write my name, I need to be able to know what my name looks like. I have to think about what I'm going to write. I have to engage my muscles. So I'm doing multiple steps all at the same time. And most of us are able to do that pretty unconsciously. But when you have trauma, your other senses are so heightened that a lot of those unconscious processes aren't able to be completed.
That makes sense. So executive functioning is really a matter of being able to handle a lot of sensory experience all at the same time and being able to read, write, and do arithmetic or whatever subject might be in the classroom going on with all the different sensory stimulation that's occurring. So
right.
That executive functioning is pretty important. Now, what might cause a disruption of that executive functioning that parents hadn't considered until now?
So one of the things that can cause executive functioning difficulties is a heightened senses. When a student has trauma, they have had to go into the fight, or freeze so many times that that's what their body becomes used to. So when they're in a school situation, although it's a safe place, and most of the students are able to accept that safety, a student with trauma cannot. So they're still being hyper vigilant about everything around them, especially when it's a new environment. So that impedes them from being able to concentrate on school.
So for our audience and for our purposes, we define trauma as any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, and unpredictable. Now, we're putting on the conference that's specific to trauma and healing for adopted children, but trauma impacts all parents and all kids across the board. It's any stressful event which is prolonged, overwhelming, and unpredictable. And so a really, really good sign of an early trauma experience that maybe you don't even know, maybe you haven't dealt with, maybe you haven't had to go to a counselor around, is that your child has a heightened sensitivity to the sensory environment. This is very important. That is, your child when in an environment like a classroom, they can't sit still, they can't pay attention, or they yell out and have outbursts, or when on the playground they have really high impulsivity, so they may be prone towards pushing other children, or unable to really play with age appropriate peers. These are all indicators that potentially somewhere in your child's history, there has been a traumatic event. A traumatic event doesn't have to mean that, they've been physically abused or sexually abused or grossly neglected. It could mean that maybe there was an early birth trauma. It could mean that there was some disruption in the early attachment and bonding process. It could mean that they're being bullied in school and they haven't been able to communicate about it. It could mean so many things outside of what we know trauma to be as physical and sexual abuse or neglect. It's so much bigger than that. Frequent moves. Maybe they were in foster care and they had 5 to 10 moves, and now going to school, leaving their existing foster placement and going to school signals that they might not return to that foster home, or they might not return to the adoptive home. So there are so many variables, and we could go on and on and on about this. But Opal, let me ask you a question. What is it about your early experience that prompted you to find IEPs and the study of IEPs and the law very important?
Well, I was a foster youth and adopted. So I know firsthand how that trauma affects families and individuals. I also, once I got to college, was diagnosed with a learning disability. Unfortunately, when I was growing up, we didn't have services like LEAF. And even the IEPs were in a more infantile stage. So now I'm able to help our students get the things that I would have benefited from as a child myself.
Oh, so that brings up a really good point. How is an IEP beneficial to the child?
Mm-hmm. So an IEP is going to give that child access to services, accommodations, and modifications. So first, let me explain what the difference is between an accommodation and a modification. An accommodation is something that does not change the state standard, but it helps the students. So maybe the class has to do 50 problems, and that student is going to become overwhelmed doing 50 problems, but they can do 10, or they can do 10 now and 10 later, and we break it up. That hasn't changed the state standard because they're still expected to learn the same material. However, sometimes a student's academic ability isn't at the same level as our students. So they're not going to be able to even remember how to do the math steps. So they're going to practice using a calculator, and they're going to learn to use a calculator as a life skill. That completely changes. They're not meeting the state standard. They're meeting an alternative special education standard. So that's one of the ways that we help our students. And then also getting additional services to help our students with whether it be organization, specialized academic instruction, occupational therapy, speech therapy. The list goes on. It's really limited to the imagination of the IEP team of the supports that we can help our child with.
So I like that you say it's limited to the imagination of the IEP team, because first of all, most parents don't even know that an IEP is an option. And second of all, I feel like IEPs in schools oftentimes are pretty narrow-minded in what needs to happen or what should happen for a child. I'll give you an example. I was a consultant on a case for a child who had been grossly neglected and abused. He had been in school the previous year, and then he had been rescued from the home and placed in foster care after going to the hospital. It was a terrible case of abuse and neglect. And so he was going to be returning to school. And so on the IEP meeting that the school had that I participated in, prior to his return, we all got together and they started reviewing his past IEP. At no point did anyone talk about the abuse and the trauma that this child had been through.
Correct.
They were solely focused on what his past IEP was, what the goals should be, how to modify it. It was so absent any depth of understanding. And these are like the main professionals in the school that are responsible for this child's success. It was so absent of any comprehension, any processing of what he'd gone through. And I found it so interesting. And I actually had to bring it to the attention of the team and just say, hey, we need to talk about what this kid's gone through, because this is going to redefine his entire educational academic trajectory. And so I bring that up because what do you feel like parents need to be focused on when it comes to advocating for an IEP or getting the things necessary to help their child be successful with the support of an IEP?
One of the things that I advise my families to do is in every IEP, they go over the strengths and the interests of the child. And that's very important to make sure that we're talking, that the team remembers this is a child and not just another number, student ID number. The other thing I do is that they have to go over the parent concerns. So what I tell my parents is to literally say that my concern is that my student has endured so much trauma in their life that they need assistance in dealing with that trauma and being able to feel safe and engaged at school.
That's very important what you're saying, because I feel like a lot, just based on my last 25 years experience, I feel like a lot of parents don't realize that it is important for the school to understand the history that the child has that they're bringing to the classroom. It's like right. They want to. I was in another IEP and I had to say, this young man was being sexually abused for the last 7 years of his life, and no one knew anything about it. And they were like, well, we didn't know that.
Right. And it's really hard to help something you don't know on one hand. And the other thing is we get so roped into this is the way, it should be, that we forget to take the individual into consideration and how each person, not only what they've experienced, but how they deal with it. Because one of the difficulties is traditionally an ED diagnosis has been emotionally disturbed. It's now been changed to emotional disability because we've got two types of people. We've got people who when they get angry and frustrated, they lash out. They're the ones that throw chairs, curse out the teacher, run away. And then we have the other ones that turn it inside and cut themselves or just go blank and disassociate, those kinds of things. Every child is going to do something in order to help protect themselves. I was speaking with my mom today, and she had read the book that I wrote, which is on forgiveness, and it's a book that's helping people to heal. And what she said to me was, I didn't realize all the things that you were going through. So the way that I coped was I told people enough to where they thought I was being open and telling everything so that I could guard those things I didn't want anybody to know.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Paul, what's the name of your book, and where can our listeners find it at?
The book is called Why 70 times 7, and it can be found at Amazon. The best place is to find it at Lulu's Publishing, but it can be found at Amazon as well.
And it's called Wise 70 times 70?
Yes.
70 times 7?
Yes.
Okay. And what does that mean?
70 times 7 is the number of times that you should forgive someone according to the Bible. So it is a devotional, and it really talks about why are we forgiving? Who are we forgiving? And what is the significance of forgiveness in faith and also just in our daily lives? The person who edited the book is not affiliated with any specific religion, but felt like she really got a lot out of this book as well. So it's
fantastic. Okay.
It's really meant for anyone.
Wise 70 times 7. We'll make sure we put a link to that in the description below. So I didn't know that emotional disturbance had been reclassified as emotional disability. That's very interesting. That's very interesting.
And it really, that way we can look at two different types of classrooms. So when you talk about a non-public school, there are actually two types of non-public schools. Those that service the students that have behaviors that are outward, and those schools that service students who have behaviors that are more inward. And that ends up protecting all of the students that way, because you don't want someone who internalizes trauma to be subjected to trauma every day by someone throwing a desk.
Excellent point. So I have a question. How do parents get comfortable talking to the professionals and the teachers about their child's trauma history? And sometimes parents don't even know. They don't even know their child has had trauma. They just know their child has all these behavior problems. All
behavior is communication, number one. So if your child is experiencing some sort of behavior difficulties, you can understand that they have had some sort of a trauma. Now, what that trauma looks like or is different for everybody. You know, I had a friend of mine who was telling her most embarrassing moment, and it was when her nylons were around her ankles and kind of looked like elephant ankles, is the way she described it. That wouldn't be something that was traumatizing for me, because I really doesn't bother me. But each person's version of trauma is individual. So we can't say, well, that's not traumatizing. Sure. It's not traumatizing to you, but it may be traumatizing to them.
That's an excellent point.
And
how we perceive the trauma.
And each person's measure of resilience is different too. Mm-hmm. You know, that if I'm given one of those early education, what's that called? ACEs. If I'm given an ACEs score, I score 100%. I check every single ACEs box.
Adverse Childhood Experiences Survey.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So if I check every single box, how am I where I am today? Because I have a higher resiliency. Mm-hmm. And so we have to take that into account. Each person has a different trauma capacity and a different resiliency score.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Why do you feel like schools have such a difficult time being creative when it comes to IEPs and getting kids the support?
I think there's two factors. The first factor is that anything that they do comes out of their budget. So sometimes they don't want to do things because of a budgetary concern. Mm-hmm. But that's why we have the federal government IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is to prevent that. And the other thing is they just don't think of it. I mean, you've got at least 12, usually 20, 30 kids in the classroom, trying to give services to one specific kid. You just become really rote in a lot of the things that you do.
That's right. So we're going to go ahead and start wrapping this up. You're going to be presenting on IEPs at our November conference, which we'll record and also will be made available virtually for anyone throughout the country or the world that wants to join us live. You'll have access to the virtual. Give me 3 of the things that you're going to share during your workshop at our conference. And I want you to tell parents what is the best way to request an IEP for their child. So 3 things you're going to be sharing at the conference, and what's the best way for parents to go about requesting an IEP?
Well, the best way to go about requesting an IEP is to do it in writing, to have it time and date stamped, and follow it up with an email to the principal and child's teacher if they're in elementary school. If they're in junior high or high school, you're going to do it to the principal, the homeroom teacher, and the counselor. So I am making sure everything's in writing and everyone has a copy of it. The things that I am going to share at the conference is we're going to talk about how vibration in the classroom helps or disrupts a student's learning.
Okay, fantastic.
We're going to talk about how to traverse an IEP in a trauma-sensitive way, and also how teachers, educators, and parents who homeschool can help regulate a student when they're overwhelmed in school.
Excellent. That sounds great. Those are all great topics. Opal, I'm super excited to have you on our team. You are already changing so many lives of parents and families and kids throughout Northern California through our Parents in Training wraparound program. And I am super excited to have you come and speak and share with parents and professionals at our first annual Adoption, Trauma, and Healing Conference in Northern California at UC Davis.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you for joining us today, Opal.